everybody. Hi, I'm Veve Jaffa. I'm an independent game developer and artist creating interactive installations and experimental experiences in FMV and VR. And I'm really excited to talk to all of you today in this fabulous space, super fitting for my talk, and also this amazing festival. Please don't groan. Everyone's allowed to do that at least once per day at this festival. That was mine. So as you can see from the opening slide, this talk is called Punch Up, Using VR for Narrative and Political Resistance. Before I begin, I just want to give a content warning. This talk will discuss and have depictions of physical violence, fascism, and Nazis, though I'll mostly be talking about killing them. And since we're in a former Taekwondo studio, and maybe some of us are tired from last night, or got up early this morning, or didn't sleep at all, in my case, last night, I thought maybe we could start out with some breathing exercise and just kind of come into the space together and calm down and take care. So I'm going to do that for a moment. If you'd like to do it in your seat or stand up with me, you're welcome to join me. I'm just going to do that. You know what, I'm going to take this off too. All right. Okay. So. All right. Global fascism is on the rise. It's quite exhausting. I think maybe our heads are a little bit tense. We want to just roll them around. Get some of the oppression off our shoulders. Ah, that's good. Maybe we want to lift up this way. Get our arms nice and stretched for a big punch later. Should we just do a few of these? Pretend Richard Spencer is to the left. Pretend Richard Spencer to the right. Okay, so we feel warm and loose and good? Yeah? Okay. Cool. So, I feel better. All right. So, here are some images. What do people think about these pictures? Is there an underlying theme with these pictures, maybe? They're definitely video games. I admit that. So I think maybe it would be fair to say they all depict violence. Does everyone agree? Yes. Okay. And what about these? So do people recognize the final image, maybe? From Papers, Please, yes. So I guess the point of bringing up these two sets of images was that while the systemic violence depicted in the latter three images is far more implicit, they're just as violent as the former. So unlike the first series of images, the resulting violence of these acts aren't always immediate nor explicit, so we're less likely to acknowledge them or mobilize to stop them. And the final image, taken from Papers, Please, explores the inherently violent, inequitable systems that govern our lives. Denying a refugee status in a safer country likely won't result in immediate injury or death for that person, but it will impact the safety and well-being of that particular victim of state violence with the same efficacy of a bullet. So why is this distinction important for my talk today? Well, in the same ways we read equally violent actions with varying degrees of severity, we do the same with actions of political resistance. So standing physically on the front lines, while crucially important, is not the only kind of necessary and important work our communities can offer. But this image, for example, and the particular kind of action portrayed often holds more weight in activist communities than, say, this one. This is a grassroots organization based in the US called Food Not Bombs. It's been around since the 1980s, and they collect, cook, and distribute food to protest war and poverty. Essential integral roles like taking care of each other's most basic needs like food, shelter, safety, and community aren't the kinds of roles we often recognize or choose to depict in our art. That brings me to my particular means of resistance and the reason we're here today. Giving this talk here at a maze in Berlin feels particularly fitting because this is where I began my journey developing my VR game and my art as political resistance, Nakam. So development on Nakam began last year with a trip to an abandoned site that would serve as both narrative inspiration and photogrammetrically constructed game environment. Players begin the game with their first day on the job, working in a 1940s-era German bakery. They are tasked with baking a dauntingly large order for the day and need to work quickly and effectively to complete the order. However, the player doesn't realize until the end of their shift that this is no ordinary bakery. Your boss encouraging you to bake as much bread as possible is none other than Jewish freedom fighter and a poet, Abba Kovnel. The egg wash you spread upon your bread is in fact highly potent arsenic-based. And the bread you're making isn't for ordinary German customers, it's for the nearby imprisoned SS officers awaiting trial in Nuremberg for crimes against humanity. This image is from a really awesome Twitter called fascists_exe. Every day they post a different thing that kills fascists, and I thought this was really fitting for my game. So the game's narrative, based on the true story of Jewish resistance group Nakam, is what brought me to the perfect real-life location upon which to set my bread-baking Nazi-killing simulator, an abandoned former SS bakery in Oranienburg, Germany. Okay, obviously this is from GDC. I'm not even going to try to mask the fact that I took this slide. Just pretend it says amaze at the top. So this is a picture of the trip that I took, and this is the river that I went over. It's across from Sachsenhausen concentration camp and memorial. And this bakery was forcibly built and run by only a few dozen prisoners in 1941 to feed the entire population of the nearby camp, then later repurposed to feed survivors after its liberation in 1945. As you can see here, I've illustrated the trip between the camp and the bakery with a squid emoji and an aerial view provided by Google Maps. Since squids can swim, I put myself over the river, but if you decide to visit, you should use the bridge. So in reality, I took the train and 2 buses from Berlin, then walked the remaining 3.3 kilometers from Sachsenhausen, deeper into the forest and further from the sanitized and respectable site of death behind me. I knew I'd made it to the right place when I saw this plaque, the only giveaway that the overgrown plot of land I was about to enter had any significant historical meaning at all. Choosing the site instead of one of the many that Germany had designated worthy of recognition was an important part of my process in telling this story. I chose to focus on a physical location that had been as neglected as the story of Nakam and their acts of political resistance. Making the visit and including the space as a photogrammetric model in the game served more as an act of radical historical documentation than artistic decision. That may or may not be me. This is where using VR stood out as the obvious choice for this particular story. VR exists in this wonderfully liminal space between digital and physical, engaging sensory simulation through a number of modalities that aren't offered by traditional flat media. By reproducing physical models and textures as the basis for world building, we not only stand to create environments that encourage players to neurologically fill in the blanks, but can also create compelling bridges between narrative and environmental design, each in-game object a carefully chosen word in the bodies of our own stories. For all the talk of VR being inherently less accessible than other game platforms, which, by the way, I completely disagree with, photogrammetry acts as a great equalizer to information in space, removing barriers to a space that's legally and physically inaccessible to most. Just as Google Earth VR gives people that opportunity to travel the world through vastly more accessible means than the reality-based alternatives, choosing to do the same for Nakam means a high-fidelity 3D rendering of the space exists for anyone who wants to visit it, and hopefully for future generations to come. So I think about the sites that commemorate the Holocaust and how othered, sanitized, and polished they often feel. How they've become monuments to thought-provoking design, institutionalized like museums. I'd never been to a site like the bakery before in my life, left abandoned and to decay. It made me think about what we deem worthy of recognition, which actions are historically canonized, who is written as a hero in the pages of history, and who is left out of the books altogether. When I think of media portraying the Holocaust, my mind immediately goes to films like Schindler's List, where Jews are predominantly portrayed as disempowered victims being rescued by morally upright allies. Why do so few stories in films and games feature Jews as the heroes of our own struggles? And further, why are only certain forms of resistance considered worthy of depicting? In choosing to pursue this neglected space and story, I wanted to focus on those often overlooked acts of political resistance I mentioned before: care, sustenance, and food. This is challah. It's a traditional, sweet, soft, often braided bread symbolizing unity among many other things. If you asked a Jew what feelings the image of this bread conjures, most would say Shabbat, our weekly day of rest, a time of necessary reflection and comfort, and a break from the hectic routine and obligations of everyday life. For most of us, to think of freshly baked challah is to think of our savta, our grandmother, standing over the counter, flour caked in the lines of her hands, beating, kneading, then braiding the dough, taking care to bake, cool, then diligently and delicately coat the bread's golden surface with egg wash for the final bake, all while the sweet, welcoming smell fills the home, the aroma marking the end of another week's work. These associations bring me back to my thinking about alternate forms of political resistance. While almost the entirety of Nakam's gameplay is centered around the task of properly kneading, shaping, and baking bread, this activity does, in the end, result in killing Nazis. A lot of them. In fact, the better your bread is baked, the higher the kill count. And while hopefully, if you're a good enough baker, many, many Nazis will die, the game looks a lot more like this than this. So for me, we have two core problems when it comes to sharing stories of political resistance through narrative and interactive art. One, stories of resistance are rarely seen through the eyes of people who are directly affected by oppression. And two, the acts of resistance we deem worthy of artistic recognition are extremely limited. My way of dealing with these issues for Nakam was to dig deeply into forgotten history and focus on portraying Jewish heroics and characters. With that goal in mind, visiting the space where Jews were persecuted and repurposing the space to reenact a story of Jewish strengths and heroics was a transgressive act, much like seeking out historical figures on which to base the story. The player's guide through the bread-baking challenge is led by real-life poet and activist Abba Kovner, who I represent in the game with a photogrammetrically composed actor in his likeness. Though he was a figure I was aware of growing up, it always bothered me that I'd never seen any major films or books depicting his heroical activism and important literary works. Some of you may recognize a phrase that became infamous with the spirit of defiance associated with the Holocaust. We will not be led like sheep to the slaughter. This was an excerpt from one of Kovner's manifestations that he frequently shared toward active protest in Nazi-occupied Poland. When he helped form Nakam, the goal was to seek justice by any means necessary, from a system that was allowing their oppressors to go unpunished. Seeking out the right space to act as a set for this resistance helped me feel closer to the story and allowed me to capture real-life inspiration like this graffiti I found on the site at the opening of the bakery, which reads in German, "We're still alive." And while we're on the topic of storytelling, would any of you seriously call this perfect example of real-life environmental storytelling bad narrative design? This is what we call in the industry a topical joke. And now for the most important part of baking bread and killing Nazis in VR, the haptics. As I considered haptic design, it was important for me to include my own politics of resistance and the fact that the game centered around the mechanic of such a culturally important activity being used as a forceful act of resistance. And that meant putting a lot of thought into how the primary action in the game would work. For anyone who's actually made challah, you'd know it's a very difficult process to get right. Much like retopologizing photogrammetric models, it's complex and involves quite a bit of back and forth between baking and forming the shape of the dough. Building on the inherent difficulty of baking not just one perfect challah, but many, I wanted to approximate a space for the player to experience difficulty that a stealth mission into the SS barracks to engage in hand-to-hand combat would provide, while never leaving the kitchen. The balance of delicacy, force, intricacy, and deliberation invites the player to a manual ballet of sorts, complex, violent, and cathartic, but never through direct combat. Centering on an activity traditionally coded as feminine offered another opportunity to explore various forms of resistance. Taking an activity typically associated with care and recontextualizing it as an act of vengeance will hopefully push players to rethink their ideas of what active resistance looks like, and the vital importance roles of care can play within political movements. Imagine being responsible for adding a romanticist, activist view to ovens in a game set during the Holocaust. Associations run hard, but I posit we can challenge and reform them with the right narrative design. Embodying both the activist and the savta, the caregiver and the killer in one, I needed the right sensory feedback to inhabit that socially dichotomous space. Working on the haptics of bread baking made me think of all the ways gender minorities throughout history were relegated to expressing discontent in their own subdued and socially appropriate ways. And through this, I thought of feedback that would offer a physical outlet for the frustration of dealing with fascism without giving away the inherently violent revelation of the game's climax. For the first time since I started developing Nakam, I was inspired by an act of anti-fascist resistance from recent history. As many of you may have remembered, seeing flooding social media and continued to this day, public fascist and hate monger Richard Spencer was recently punched in the face by an anonymous hooded hero on camera. And since then, my glittery Nazi punch meme has become prophetic, as he was recently punched again, and this time with an accompanying glitter bomb. I don't have footage of that, but it's super good, you should find it. So here I'm going to show you my favorite Richard Spencer remix video, and the resulting inspo for the haptic design in the cam. So, as you can see, some wonderful person has overlaid the UI from Street Fighter 2. It's a really awesome punch. And then here in the cam, you're going to bash the bread and feel like you're getting your aggression out. And as with all political statements in your art, please keep in mind, always punch up. Your work should make the powerful feel uncomfortable and the powerless feel powerful. By all means, use history to influence your work, but look for opportunities to empower the powerless with your art. Sometimes the inspiration you need for your story already exists in the world, but you just need to dig deep to find it and give it the artistic framework it deserves. Art, and sometimes even crimes for art, is my way of giving labor to the movement of resistance. But there's so much you can do, we can all do, to play our part to resist stronger, softer, and together for a better tomorrow. Thank you.